Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conversation on financing mining projects for junior miners. I am Petam Kunu, and I will be your moderator for today's session. We know that mining finance can be quite layered, especially considering the specific challenges and capital requirements unique to the space. According to the JMC, a junior miner is defined as a producer with an annual turnover of less than 500 million. And that's the working definition we'll use today. Although we know that not everyone here today fits neatly into that category, our goal is to share useful insights, and not just for the junior miners, but also for the many businesses and service providers that support them. South Africa has an incredible wealth of natural resources, and it's critical that we continue to grow our mining sector in ways that benefit the surrounding communities, local economies, and the broader value chain. So thank you all for joining, especially this diverse group of stakeholders that I know are on the call today. Understanding the finance landscape, what funders look for, the risks involved, and how deals are structured is critical for securing the right capital to grow your project. So without further ado, let's jump right in. We're joined today by 4 leading experts who will break this down from both a legal and a financial aspect. I'm so excited to tell you that on the call today, we have Mpho Mofokeng, who is a senior investment banker at Absa CIB within the Resources and Project Financing Division. He will be providing the commercial banking perspective on what makes a mining project fundable. We also have Thabiso Sekano, who is the head of mining and metals at IDC, who will be sharing the development finance perspective on funding for junior miners. We also have our True Blue CDH partners on the call. We have Vivian Chaplin, who is our partner in mergers and acquisitions, specializing in M&A and heads up our CDH mining sector team. And finally, but not least, we have Mashudu Mpafudi, partner in banking and finance here at CDH, who will be advising on mining finance agreements and risk mitigation, who's also here at CDH. So good afternoon to our panelists, and thank you so much for joining. We're especially pleased to have senior bankers and transactors from IDC and Absa joining us today, as you've heard in my intro. Their deep industry experience and their insights are incredibly valuable, and we're grateful to have them in the room. That said, I just want to let you know that while we appreciate that there's so many questions and we're all inquisitive for knowledge on this call, this session isn't specifically intended to discuss any specific requests or proposals or individual projects or that application you sent through. It's also not quite the forum to unpack any junior mining exploration fund or any other similar schemes that operate at both the IDC and Absa. So our guests here today have come in their personal and professional capacity to share broader knowledge and learnings. And with that in mind, we would really like today to be a conversation, for it to be interactive and engaging. So you're more than welcome to post general questions and comments on the chat throughout the session, and I'll make sure that our panelists have time to respond to those at the end. So as always, let's approach the discussion with respect, curiosity, and an open mind, and let's dive right in. Welcome to all my panelists today. How are you all doing today?
Great, thank you. Welcome everybody, and so good to see such a good, diverse group. And thank you very much, Mpho and Thabiso. We're so grateful you could join us.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Petra. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Good to see you also, Mpho and Thabiso. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm going to dive right in, and let's get to setting the foundation for junior miners on financing options and what exactly funders look for. So I'm going to start with Mpho. Can you tell us from a commercial banking perspective, what makes a mining project fundable?
So I've got a couple of points that I've put together in terms of high level. We don't have, just that question alone could be a whole course, but I just want to kind of nip that in the bud and just kind of, let me start off with a bankable feasibility study. Would like to kind of review, when you come to a bank, would like to be able to review a bankable feasibility study that's kind of has a financial model that's associated with it. One of the things that it may be obvious, but I just want to state it because I've had a project approach me in the last 12 months. We fund against reserves. We do not fund against resources. And I think it's just something to keep in mind. An experienced management team that has built a mine before. If you're building a mine, would like to make sure that you actually know how to run a mine, because we are backing the team. We're not necessarily backing just the ore body. And then also a story around where you're going to raise equity, who you're going to get it from, and is it realistic to be able to kind of expect it to be raised? There's some debt projects where we've provided debt funding on the expectation that equity will be raised, and the equity markets were not alive, and so the equity was never raised. So it's just something to take in mind. An offtake, where are you going to sell to? Having an offtake is critical, and it may be that it's a trader, but knowing where you're going to sell to, even if it's just at a head of terms level, just to know kind of who you've got in mind. Typically in projects, we like to hedge. Are you open to hedging your commodity? Is your commodity hedgeable? Not all commodities are. In an ideal picture, a big brother, a sponsor, whether it's a financial sponsor or it is a technical sponsor, it always helps if there are problems further along the road. And the last point I want to state, which is maybe obvious to some of you, but can the project repay its debt at the current spot price? There are many projects that have come to me and they've told me, the prospects for this sector are great, the price is going to go up, but that is equity. That is not how commercial banks look at things. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mpho. And I think it's very important, like you said, is that it's more about the reserve and not the resources. So you might strike gold, but you're going to need a team. You're going to need maybe a big brother and other things as well. So thanks for sharing that with us. And maybe to go on to you, Thabiso, just hearing what Mpho's saying and the requirements of what funders look for, we understand that the IDC also plays a crucial role in financing junior miners. What criteria do you consider from the IDC perspective when funding mining projects?
Hi, thanks, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible enough. Yes, look, I mean, Mpho has largely covered me, to be quite honest with you. Our overarching criteria in funding junior miners, or any miner for that matter, is we want to see economic merit. And when you break down economic merit, it's really fundamentally the issues that Mpho has raised, which is on the one side, you've done a proper job in analyzing your resource and reserve, which comes with a proper mining plan, which we call life of mine plan, which comes with an associated financial model, which comes with a proper processing facility and process overall, and ultimately that product can go to market and service the loans that we would have put into that. So that in essence is how a financial funding model would work in any instance. But we focus also more on the developmental impact within the IDC. We want to look at projects that have got a huge developmental impact, and that can be broken down into several sections, maybe say a huge resource that you want to mine over a long period of time, because we want to see the impact, the economic impact in the communities around where our mines are situated. We are more or less commodity neutral in South Africa. We want to try and fund as much as possible the mines that will create jobs, because again, key in one of our criteria is job creation in South Africa. I mean, we all know how low or how high the number is of unemployed people in South Africa, particularly when you come to the youth. And of course, I mean, we fund on the basis that you've got all the regulatory approvals in place that you require to operate legally. That is also very, very, very important for us. So I think maybe let me stop there. I mean, there's a whole book that we can write, like Mpho indicated, dealing with this specific question. Thanks.
Let's say it's not easy for all our guests here today. It's not easy to compact years and years of work into a 5-minute answer, but we really appreciate our panelists for doing so. let's talk a bit more. Thabiso, we've spoken about economic merit, and Mpho, you've also spoken about the risks around equity, etc. If I can bring it back to more of a legal perspective, and I'd just like to get input from Mashudu on what are the key financing options available to junior miners. We understand that there's equity, there's debt, there's streaming agreements, there's so much, and how do these compare?
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon to everyone. Let's take it back, Peter, in relation to the basics, right? There are various options, obviously, in relation to funding some of these projects. The first one being, as mentioned earlier, is equity finance, which can come in a form of the sponsors or the shareholders subscribing for shares in the project company, or subscribing for preference share in the project company. That also has got a downside to it in the sense that the incoming sponsors or shareholders can potentially dilute the current existing shareholders in the project company. Then the opposite of that is obviously debt finance, where ordinarily you could get a senior lender coming into the project, providing senior debt funding at a particular interest rates with some financial covenants that needs to be complied with. And also there could be a possibility of a subordinated debt, which will ordinarily rank below the senior debt in terms of the repayment terms. And then we've also seen instances where there can be a mezzanine funder in the project. And those mezzanine funders normally are third parties like insurance companies or pension funds, even though their rate might be higher, but they do assist in closing the gap. The other alternative in terms of funding is bonds. We've seen in the market that, particularly with projects that are more matured, the project company can issue a bond at a fixed interest rate in relation to raise capital in the project. And then you did mention an alternative in relation to royalties, which essentially involve a situation whereby a potential investor will provide capital on the understanding that they will share in the percentage of the profits based on the production that are being produced and the minerals that are being sold. And then related to that is obviously the streaming arrangement, where essentially it encompasses a situation whereby a potential investor basically secures a right to be able to purchase the production or the minerals at a certain price in future. Those are really broadly, the available options in relation to raising capital in a project company in the South African market, and to a large extent, it also applies in the international market.
It seems like this. Thank you so much, Mashudu. It seems like there's some traditional methods of financing, which are the ones that are more popular, perhaps. And it seems like there's also some untraditional methods, such as the streaming, etc., as you've noted. So I'd like to kind of refocus and recenter our view on providing practical insights for our junior miners today on how do they secure that funding, how are they structuring the deals, and how do they manage all these risks associated with running these mining projects. If I can just direct my question to you, Thabiso, and really, speaking about bonds, etc., and everything that Mashudu has spoken about, what type of security does the IDC require from junior miners?
Yeah, a controversial one with security being a development finance institution.
Yes, I'm putting you a little bit on the spot.
Yes, no, it's fine. So we always say we like to crowd in funding as the IDC. So, and I mean, having given the description that you gave of a junior miner, at some point we may just partner with ABSA to finance that junior miner. And ABSA will put forward its security package, and typically we'll have a security SPV that we will put together and share pari passu in terms of that security that we would require from whatever project that we may be funding. So typically, of course, security packages include at least some of the following bonds, be it general or special notarial bonds, We would look at those depending on what we are financing. I mean, if we are financing working capital, of course, general notarial bonds would be important. In a case where we are funding equipment, special notarial bonds would be extremely important. In a case where we've got Absa or Nedbank or Standard Bank with us, the bond over the mining right is also important. They are able to access it much quicker than we can currently now with the current regulations, and we are hoping that those will change soon. And I mean, obviously, these type of bonds just allow us the opportunity to step in if it is required. We would take sessions also, sessions of shares, where you pretty much pledge your shares to the IDC should anything go wrong, to allow us maybe to find other partners who can operate that mine or that project. We also quite often would consider session of contracts also. So let's say, for example, you've got one off-taker who's giving you a life of mine contract. We would be interested in having a session of that contract also, because that secures our position should anything go wrong. And I suppose maybe the most controversial one is guarantees that we expect also to get from the project promoters. Because, when you go to a fund and you present the project, the fundamental issue is that you believe in that project and you can stand behind it. And if you believe in that project and you can stand behind it, you should be able to provide guarantees and say, at least as far as I know, this will work. Having said that, though, I think perhaps the competitive advantage about the IDC, even in terms of security package, is our patience in relation to times of trouble. Because we may, for example, fund you today on the basis of a spot commodity price, which may tank in 2 years' time. Or let's just think back about COVID and what impact that COVID had on a number of projects that we funded. We've got a more patient outlook then, despite the fact that we would require this much security to try and assist businesses to resuscitate those businesses and bring them back into production to keep on employing people. Yeah, I think perhaps let me stop there.
It seems as though to whom much is given, from the IDC perspective, much is required. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective, Thabiso. I think something that you also mentioned that I'm picking up on is that mining finance doesn't operate in a vacuum, and ABSA here on the call is also involved, and also the legal must be involved. So maybe, Mpho, if I can just ask you from a commercial bank perspective, now hearing what Thabiso has said, that, oftentimes they will go to the Mphos at ABSA and request them to also get involved. From a commercial bank perspective, what are your thoughts on this? Are we missing anything that our junior miners need to know in terms of this process of structuring deals?
I would say that I think in terms of the structuring, I think an important part is funding during ramp up. I mean, often we dimension the funding based upon the capex that's required, but we forget that there's a working capital element as the company ramps up that needs to be included in your funding package, and then also kind of allowing for a ramp up period. Often we have very optimistic promoters who say, look, I'm going to switch on my plant, and when my plant switches on day one, it's going to be operating at 100%. It takes time for a project to actually to kind of ramp up, for mining crews to start syncing together and being able to produce at capacity. So build that into your funding plan. It's an important part. Rehab. It's, SA law requires you to have guarantees or an insurance product to fund your rehabilitation. Have that in place as you're talking to your funders. Typically the banks who provide you can do that, or you can go to an insurance company. When we're looking at the offtakes, the reference price for the product that you are selling, with main board metals, the traditional kind of metals that South Africa mines, you can look it up on the LME, you can go and Google it. But when you have something exotic like diamonds, or things that are traded kind of market to market, if you look at things like lithium, graphite, the new exotic battery metals, they're not always as easy to understand in terms of the pricing mechanism. So it's just something to keep in mind. And what is your reference price for the metal that you're selling in your offtakes? When you are dimensioning your project, always remember that banks take haircuts. Banks are not, banks take a haircut to your commodity price. Banks are going to take a haircut to your production, and banks are actually going to increase your operating costs just to be conservative, because banks want to stress for the worst case. Banks don't participate in the upside, but they don't want to take, they're exposed to the downside. And then for a lot of what we've seen in some projects is that people run out of money for due diligence. You're going to be doing a lot of due diligence. The banks are going to be doing due diligence, technical due diligence, and ESG due diligence, insurance due diligence, a market study of your commodity, and also a model audit. All of that costs money. I've been involved in a project in the last year where the sponsor ran out of money for those projects, and so we couldn't actually progress going to credit because of that. And so these are things to keep in mind, that even before you get to approach banks, you need to have a little bit of money in your kitty to be able to pay for those processes.
Thank you so much, Mpho. It seems like to get these projects on the move and on the go with the help of the IDC and also from ABSA, you really, as a junior miner, have to get your house in order, whether it's from your mining, financing, in terms of how you're structuring your deal, securing your funding. Do you have the right guarantees in place? There is equal risk and opportunity from the commercial bank side, IDC, and also for the junior miner. It's just a matter of how are we structuring that deal efficiently so that everyone can get their desired outcome. And now that we've kind of discussed some of the financial implications of how to structure the deal, maybe we can speak a little bit more about the legal considerations that junior miners need to consider when they're preparing for the process of procuring funding. I'm going to hand over to Vivian Chaplin. Thank you so much for joining us, Viv. I haven't asked you a question yet, so I'm quite excited to hear what you have to say. Maybe we can just discuss things related to ownership and title of that mineral right that you have. And, we've also discussed earlier in my introduction that these mining projects are great for the junior miners themselves, the commercial banks and the economy at a large, but they also severely impact our community. So what other considerations do we need to think about when we're structuring these deals as junior miners, for junior miners? Yes.
So I think a lot of the issues have been touched on already, but where we come in as lawyers is often in the due diligence phase. And the absolute key is preparation. Okay, so I'm going to list the main considerations, but these are the issues I think that we look at for funders. But these are issues that need to be easily ascertainable. So firstly, I think it's very, very important, I think, for junior miners going to look for funding. This is the sales job of your life, right? And you've got to present something that is coherent and well organized. And perhaps in order of precedence, and again, it's a bit of like a 101, but first and foremost, of course, you have to show that you've got some title, some ownership to these reserves, right? So we know the MPRDA is not an easy piece of legislation. The Department of Mineral Resources and Petroleum is not always an easy department to navigate. So very, very important. First and foremost, primary is show title, show your mining license, show your right to the reserves. I think aligned to that is obviously the whole very complicated raft of regulatory requirements that are required in South African mining industry. And we're talking about environmental, we're talking about your BEE, we're talking about health and safety, we're talking about, the arrangements with the owners of the surface rights. So really, there's a lot of regulatory compliance, and it must be organized and presented in a way that does not cause delays or concerns to your financier, because if you're causing concerns at that early stage when they're looking at title, your project's going to be dead in the water. The next issue, I think, which is obviously critical from a commercial perspective, is the documentation to show that you do have a market, that there's potential for sales, that there's either an offtake agreement or letter of intent or something quite firm to indicate, sort of from a documentation perspective, that there really is, a commercial market out there that will enable the financiers to be interested enough to look at your project further. I think there's obviously the security and collateral, which we've already discussed. Often when projects get off the ground, right at the beginning, things are, money is expensive, and right at the beginning, some things might have been given away early on. So you've got to be really, really careful that, you right at the beginning of a project, you haven't pledged shares or given notarial bonds over equipment or given everything away, that by the time you want the real money, you've actually got nothing left to offer. And we've seen that quite a lot, and I'm sure that the bankers on the call have seen that quite a lot. So security is important. Obviously, you have to have really thought ahead about your project. The community issues, I think, are a big issue in South Africa, especially in the communities in which you operate, that you've got the risk mitigation strategies in place, that you understand your community, that there's a good relationship with the current shareholders. And then finally, I think we mustn't overlook just the corporate governance and documentation issues. I think a huge critical issue these days for any funders or all stakeholders is anti-corruption, good corporate governance. Everybody is going to be scrutinized for a health check, and is going to be looked into, very intensely. So, good documentation, good transparency, and good preparation, and keep it centrally so that when you need to present all of that in a VDR or in the due diligence, everything is easily accessible.
Definitely. I think evidently, and maybe the junior miners on the call can on some level agree with this, but it seems as though there's a lot of moving parts to getting your mining project going. But also there is a solution. As Vivian has gladly told us, preparation breeds success. You have to be prepared in order to be able to seize those opportunities from both lender perspectives and also from a legal perspective. And it seems like a multi-layered approach is what works best. You need to be considering the regulatory. You need to be considering the community aspects. If I can maybe ask Mashudu this question, and Viv, you've touched on it, in that you don't want to raise any concerns for your financiers right off the bat. From a banking and finance legal perspective, how can our junior miners mitigate these lender concerns right off the bat, and maybe for the duration of the project as well?
Thanks, Pat. I think Paul touched on this earlier on, because this aspect, it's not purely legal. It's got some commercial considerations to it. For example, he mentioned that you must have the experience in the industry that you want to explore. And also the fact that the lenders also look at the team that is behind the project, because at the end of the day, they are funding they are backing the team and not necessarily the project. And also one of the things that was mentioned was the issue around a reasonable amount of equity to be in place. That is quite key in these funding structures, because if you look at it, these funding structures, they involve a lot of capex. It's a lot of money involved, and then lenders want to understand that the sponsors have a skin in the game. And then also one of the consideration that we have seen is that lenders want to see active participants in the project. They don't want passive investors, because that's quite critical for them. And then also when they look at the contracts, whether it's offtake agreement or supply agreements that are about to be concluded, they should be at arm's length. It shouldn't be that, when they examine those contracts, then they pick holes on it and say that, they are not at arm's length. They also want to be able to be convinced that, the people involved are there for the long term of the project, for the duration of the project. So that's one of the key things for them, and the ability to attract other potential investors like the DFIs into the project. It's quite key. Thanks.
I must say that it seems as though there is some sort of cohesion within this ecosystem of a mining finance, where it's not just something from a legal perspective, or it's not just something from a commercial bank perspective, but they all play together to kind of create a good deal. And maybe we can talk about what is then that path to bankability for the junior miners who are on the call today, who need actionable advice on how best they should position their projects for successful financing. Let's say there's a junior miner on this call who's maybe doing research or maybe at exploratory phase. What practical steps can junior miners take to make their projects more attractive to funders? And I know we've spoken about it throughout the call, but maybe if we can make it actionable for the junior miners. And I'm just going to ask Mpho and then also Thabiso to just tell us a little bit more about what are the practical steps that our viewers and our guests on the call today can take from today as they leave this meeting to get to the point at which you as APSA or you as the IDC say, yes, this is a bankable project. Yeah.
I think one of the things I've learned practically is that a project that is being packaged and brought by an advisor is much easier for it to be funded, because the advisor typically would know what a financing institution would look for. You can do it yourself. You can save yourself a couple of pennies, but you may not be successful at it. You may have the wrong information. And then the other thing that Vivian has already mentioned, have all your documents, know what where to get them. There's an instance where we're looking at funding a project, and the resource statement was a CP to financial close, and then it couldn't be found. The latest one couldn't be found. It was a listed company, and looking back, it's one of the companies that went under during kind of that I funded. So it maybe showed kind of that their housekeeping wasn't all in order. Prepare an overview of your project. Often what happens is that when a junior miner comes to me, they say, here's my data room, and it's got 20 documents in there. And I don't necessarily have the time to go and read all of the documents. And that's why I would say, prepare an overview of your project, a 20-pager that captures all the key issues that you require. And then differentiate between an equity story and a debt story. For your equity providers, you can tell them about the upside in the project and the blue sky and how much money you're going to make from kind of growth. But from a debt perspective, we are just protecting our bottom line. We just hope that our money comes back. We give you 100 million and we charge a margin, let's say 10%. That 10% is all our return. To tell me that the share price is going to triple or quadruple, doesn't work for me. So just be aware of kind of what I'm looking for is what caps my downside. And then know your project. It speaks to being an experienced management team. When you engage with us, and I ask a question about, what's your grade or what is your recoverability? Know the numbers, have them at the fingertips. If you don't know them and tell me you're going to go look inside your BFS, it just, you reducing credibility. You look like you don't know what you're doing. And remember that we don't give the money to the project. We give the money to you. You are the sponsor. You're the jockey.
I particularly like that last line, and I actually noted it down here. I'm seeing so much emphasis on the team, and you as the person who is coming to get the funding or request the funding, you need to have your story together. You must have the vision. I've always heard this term, and now I'm really seeing it in action, that you bet on the jockey and not the horse. So you need to be prepared, and to answer any of the questions, you need to know your financials when a funder is looking to you for those answers. And then Thabiso, is there anything that maybe you can elaborate on from Mpho's perspective, or anything new that you'd like to add from your perspective on what is the practical, actionable items that our junior miners can do to get to that path on to bankability?
I'm laughing to myself here alone, thinking about the last point that Mpho just mentioned here. You know, a couple of years ago, I was approached by somebody who said to me, I want the IDC to fund me buy a mine. And I asked him what is this mine? What commodity are we talking about? And that particular person didn't know. So it talks a lot about to what you've just mentioned here. Perhaps let me just go, on the softer side, and I think this question really summarizes a whole lot of things that we've said on this call, and I'm going to focus more again on what Vivian said. What makes a project, and I'm going to be biased and say to the IDC, what makes a project more attractive to the IDC. We've spoken about governance. We understand the limited budget that junior miners have. But a proper governance structure is extremely important. And let's take it from a board level. Often what we find is that these junior mining companies would be one-man shows or a family show, which creates a bit of a problem from our side, because we want to see independence who help you look at this project and take care of it properly. And typically we would have a condition that you should have independent board members to take care of this project. I mean, that's extremely important when you're running into billions, because you start as a junior miner today based on the definition that you put forward when you started this call. But 5 years down the road, you are somebody very significant in the mining sector, and you need to be reckoned with, and you've got ambitions to be listed. You need to make sure that some of these things are important. We also prefer to have people who come to us who are not and I think Mahudi mentioned this earlier on, portfolio investors sitting somewhere in Sandton and not really looking at the operation. So we prefer to have people who are actually hands-on involved in the project. I mean, this is quite attractive for an organization such as the IDC. It's still part of governance and management, I suppose. As we have indicated earlier on in the call, prepare your project in such a manner that it is attractive not only to the IDC, but to any other potential funder out there. Because our key motto, as I've mentioned earlier on, is we want to crowd in funding. Remember that the IDC's role, when you think about it in most projects, is a facilitator role. We want to de-risk projects and get them ready so that Mpho can run after them alone at the later stage. But and that's what we want to do. So that project has to be prepared in such a manner that it is attractive to everyone who's a potential funder. I cannot overemphasize the issue of employment, ladies and gentlemen on the call. That is extremely important for us. The more people we can employ in the project, and I'm not saying when you come to the IDC, you must fake the number of people that we can employ. We understand we live in the modern age where employment is not what it used to be in the olden days. A gold mine in the olden days could employ upwards of 4,000 people. These days, they don't anymore. We understand that part, but try and be considerate to those things. You have to have plans to mine responsibly. Yes. And this talks to the ESG component. That also is an attractive point for a development finance institution such as us. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, that we are also getting funding from international DFIs that they channel through the IDC so that we can use it in South Africa. And ESG is the most important thing that you can ever think of currently in the world. And then something a little bit controversial, more developmental. Can we think about shareholding in these businesses in a manner that it becomes broad-based? Instead of us funding one particular person, irrespective of whether that one particular person is a previously disadvantaged South African. I think this is critical and important, and it's becoming more and more attractive for the IDC to consider broad-based structures. Why don't you, for example, bring along communities that you're operating in and make them shareholders in this business? Talk to us as the IDC and say, how can you help us make these people shareholders in this business? Why don't you bring in your employees who live just a few steps away from the mine and make them shareholders in this particular business? And why don't these communities benefit beyond what the SLP requirements are in terms of your mining right? Can you do a little bit more than just building a clinic down the road through this type of shareholding structure? I think we understand that these shareholding structures are designed based on what the DMR requirements are in terms of getting a license, but we prefer to see something a lot more than just that from a broad-based perspective. And I mean, of course, I mean, everything else we've spoken about in terms of project merits, the ability to execute that project, you know, from beginning to the end and having access to the market. I thought that is just important to show people the softer things that we should actually be moving towards, which I'm hoping at some point will be emphasized as part of this ESG concept overall. Thanks.
Yes, I think, Viv, I see you nodding, and it seems like you are resonating quite a lot. I'm going to put you on the spot because this is not a question that I'd intended to ask you, but I feel like you can have so much more to share. Is there anything that you'd like to add on top of what Thabiso's saying in terms of being more broad-based in terms of shareholding?
It's not. This is not an easy thing, right? There's you know, we live in a very interesting country. There's a responsibility that I think that that one has as someone who's developing the country's resources to the communities and the people who inhabit the country and inhabit the community and the environment where you're going to be exploiting that resource. And obviously we've got the BE Act, and we've got the mining charter, and we've got the empowerment considerations that the funding institutions and the banks want, and these are, you know, overlap and are complex, and generally for a mining project you do really need perhaps, you know, the big brother shareholder, the sort of big industrialist experienced shareholder. You generally do need some employee share scheme, and these are not always easy schemes to administer, and they're complex, and sometimes, you know, our other government institutions like SARS don't necessarily make it very attractive, so we have to navigate those, and they're complex. But I think one of the most complex ones is this whole issue of communities and proper broad-based empowerment in the communities. You know, I think as Thabiso said, the days of building a clinic or a school and, you know, ticking that box are done. Those are still important, and a lot of you know, a lot of communities have actually been supported and established by mining companies over many years, and we still got to continue doing that. But proper empowerment, proper community engagement is critical, but it's not easy. And you know, I think that's what like separates out a good project from a bad project, is understanding exactly who is in the community and how best to navigate that. So absolutely key, but not an easy road in this country, I think.
And I think I can appreciate how multi-layered it is to kind of get a mining project going, and maybe to bring it back to what Thabiso was also saying earlier about employment. You know, Mpho said, you know, you can try to do this thing yourself, and I'm all for a can-do attitude, but it seems like you need the right people on your team, whether it's from a legal perspective or whether it's from a financing perspective, internally as well, good governance, boots on the ground, as Thabiso has said, to really get this going. I don't think that I haven't seen it before, and maybe our financiers or our legal colleagues on the chat can maybe say if they've ever seen a successful mining project being run by one person. I highly doubt it. I highly doubt it. So maybe let's now talk about alternative financing structures that junior miners should consider? I've spoken a little bit about it earlier. I think Thabiso had touched on it, and Mashudu, you've also touched on it. If I can just ask you to expand a little bit on what are those traditional financing structures, but more importantly, what are the roads less traveled that junior miners can really explore in terms of structuring their mining projects and going beyond traditional bank lending, so to speak? Yeah.
Thanks. I think one of the things that is not explored as much in the market is the option around, for example, vendor finance. Vendor finance can also play a critical part in terms of making sure that, junior miners at the initial stage are able to get their project off the ground. And then also, the role of the very same sponsors putting their own equity on the line to basically make sure that the project gets off the ground, and the lenders can be able to view it and be convinced that if the sponsors believe in the project, they've deployed significant funds in the project, then that makes it attractive to the lenders to look at that particular project. However, going forward, what we have seen is that, because these projects are highly capex intensive, is the fact that, there are cost overruns. Even though financial models might have been built that foresees the possibility of, the project going well, but it does happen that, there are project cost overruns in the project, and then sponsors should be prepared for that. Because not all the time will the bank be able to say, we'll give you a cost overrun facility. There is a point where the lenders will say, you know what, we could give you X facilities, we can't go beyond that. So a big brother in the project, it's always important, and the ability to follow on your equity, it's quite important in projects. Yeah, thanks.
And just because we're receiving a question on the chat that's very topical, Ditebe Boho has requested that you please elaborate on what vendor financing is for our junior miners on the call who might actually not even be familiar with that term.
Yeah, vendor finance essentially includes a situation where, for example, you find a key player in the project, like an EPC contractor who believes in the project that it could work and takes risks on the project by providing funding in the project with a view of getting its return at a particular point in time, in circumstances where the bank or traditional banks would not be able to participate.
So we've heard this term in the call today, big brother. You're looking for a big brother in this sort of situation. I'm going to ask one more question before we go over to the Q&A section. And I'd like to term this khafa, danger. If I can ask our panels today, maybe starting with you, Mpho, what is something that you have seen a junior miner do, or something that has happened in a project that immediately from your perspective was like, we cannot fund this project? Yeah.
I just wanted to reiterate Thabiso's point. I mean, it's actually 2 points that have been mentioned. One is social license to operate, and the other one is your ESG. ESG these days is a very important thing. All mining projects that we look at, and when I say project, I mean developmental projects, not existing mines, require an Equator Principles ESG review. We have, and so that is quite a detailed and quite an onerous review that goes beyond the letter of the law in South Africa. And so it's just something that if that is not there, I cannot even review it. The mine may be great, management may be great, but I cannot even touch it.
Thanks, Mpho. And to you, Thabiso, I know previously you had shared you need the person who is coming to you to know their story. Is there anything else that you'd like to add on that?
Well, if I'm taking the question that you've asked, Mpho, and Mpho would know this, we partnered together to finance a certain project. And we didn't necessarily stop and say we're not going to look at this project necessarily. But there was an issue with communities, and Vivian mentioned earlier on the issue of cohesion with communities, where communities were up in arms. And I think through the IDC credit committees, it was decided that instead of making that resolution of that problem as CP, we should rather have it resolved upfront before we finalize approving funding in that particular project. So we never necessarily say, Peter, we're not going to look at a project. We try a solution and nest it through the baby steps until we can deal with the challenges that we are facing, because we are a development finance institution. You know, we have to take that patient look at these things. Thanks.
Yes, I think the key takeaway from the IDC is get your house in order. They will be patient, they will assist, but you yourself need to have your house in order. You know, help them help you, essentially. And then I'm going to go to Mashiru. On your perspective, what are the biggest legal pitfalls that you've seen maybe in some of the work that you do, which instantly to you just made you think this is not something that is going to work long term?
Yeah, look, one of the things is, you know, as we mentioned earlier, the governance within the structure and a good offtake, because at the end of the day, you can mine, and then whatever you produce, you must have somebody who's going to be able to come and buy those products. Otherwise, there won't be the ability to repay the debt. It's compromised. So a good offtake, it's quite key. I did mention the issue around the equity contribution, which is quite key. As Paul mentioned, that, you know, in certain instances, lenders would not even go to credit committee if they are not sure that, you know, the equity check is covered. But not all lenders are like that. For example, today we received a call from one of the Chinese mining house that are keen to fund junior miners. Their approach essentially included that, you know, for them, they require that, you know, they get comfort around the fact that, you know, there's 20% of equity that is available. Once they know that 20% is available, then they can make the debt available. Not necessarily that, you know, the equity should be deployed first. So those are some of the interesting things that, you know, are coming up in terms of, you know, lenders wanting to participate in funding junior miners. And then the other criteria this chap mentioned was that, you know, they look at a loan to value of 80 to 90%. And obviously there must be a good offtake agreement and compliance with the requirements in terms of the EIA, the approvals, the mining approvals that must be in place. Then they can look at that. So it's not that, you know, they're not lenders, or lenders are limited in the space. They are lenders, including international lenders, who are available and are looking at some of these junior miners to be able to fund, provided it's a good project.
Mm-hmm. And Vivian, on your side, what are some of the biggest legal pitfalls junior miners tend to fall into, or rather that they should avoid altogether?
I think contracting for these projects is difficult and mustn't be underestimated. So first and foremost, any contract with any party is a meeting of the minds, right? And you would be quite surprised how often parties go down a certain road without really understanding what the other requires or what the other has to offer. So firstly, a meeting of the minds, get the legal, financial, technical assistance that you require in order to negotiate deals of this nature. Have regard to the regulatory conditions, the CPs, the things that can trip you up, the things that can delay you. So that obviously good due diligence and preparation. A lot of other issues we've seen is overcommitting, not understanding properly the performance milestones, not understanding what happens when you run out of runway, you know, when like in terms of ongoing financing, the fact that you need operating capital to work, the fact that you can't start producing and selling the day after commissioning your plant. These are things that really need to be understood, I think, especially by the applicants for the funding. And then ability to renegotiate, to refinance, exit strategies, and dispute resolution mechanisms. Don't underestimate that. So you really need to understand the contractual framework, and it's complex. So you do need help and advice. And I know sometimes, some of the especially the DFIs do advise and they do help. But at the end of the day, you have to make sure that you protect your interest, I think. This is for the junior miners. So we've seen a lot of things go awry. Let's put it that way. I think working at a law firm, so we've seen the end of projects as well as the beginning.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Now let's hand it over to the questions that we have. Our participants are quite excited, and I'm seeing quite a number of questions come through. I'm going to start with the first question from Lerato, who is saying, and maybe I'll table this to you, Mpho, because it's something that you mentioned while we were discussing. The question is, do the funders provide funding for rehabilitation costs for new mining rights to be granted?
So typically, you would approach a financier like us, and we would then enter into a rehabilitation guarantee structure, where you have a fund, and when you start mining, you deposit money into that, and at the end of the life, those funds would then be available for rehabilitation. You'll have to post that with the DMR as part of your licensing requirements. You can also go to insurance companies, as there are insurance companies also provide that. And these days, a lot of the mines, I've seen them move towards the insurance market, but the banks also provide it.
Okay. I am aware of time, so I'm going to take about 2 or 3 more questions. There's never enough time for these things. The next question comes from Clint Hill, who is asking, how would you de-risk investments that are caused by social compliance issues that come up after the fact when communities and their leaders come in and they're requesting a share, or they're trying to affect the production in some way? How do you deal with that issue? I'm not quite sure who will be best placed. Maybe between Vivian and Tabiso, you can share your insights on that.
I'd love to just hand it over to Tabiso, but I'll have a go. You can never completely de-risk that, right? So the moment that there's an attractive proposal that's running in your community, that's when politics start, and that's when fighting happens. So I think that the only way you can de-risk it by proper due diligence and engagement with the communities, and use local people, use local consultants. Don't come from the outside in and think you understand an environment. You have to. You can only de-risk it by preparing for it as much as possible. That said, I think it's still going to happen, because if there's money available, there will be politics and there will be fighting. I don't know, Tabiso, I'm sure you've probably got a better answer to that than me.
I think it's just pretty much the same. I assume the question is really based on the after effect. And I suppose our advice would be, it is something that you have to look at right up front and make sure that you identify the right communities. And I think the government can be able to assist in identifying those right communities. But crooks are crooks also at some point. There are people who may just come in there and want the right over something that doesn't really belong to them. And I suppose that is something that should be handled by law enforcement agencies. Thanks.
It seems as though getting ahead of this is best, and making sure that there's open engagement with the communities that you're going into. Having local people who might better understand the context than you is also crucial when you're coming into this. It's not guaranteed to prohibit any future issues, but I'm sure it certainly goes a long way when these issues do arise. This is my second to last question. I'm going to table it to Mashudu. We have a question here about off-takes from Lerato, and it's something that you've also touched on. She's asking whether an off-take that is for a duration of a year is still valid, or is there more of a time limitation for the validity of off-takes? Do you have to show that this is something that's going to happen for 10 years, for 20 years, or is 1 year enough? Yeah.
Yeah, Peter, the important consideration here is the fact that, when you're doing a project like this, a mining project, it's long-term base, right? And then the nature of the funding that you're going to raise from, whether it's a commercial bank or a DFI, it's long-term as well. So ideally, the term of the offtake must match the term of your debt. Because if there's a mismatch, then the project company won't be able to repay the debt. If the offtake is for a year, and then the project financing that you're getting from IDC, APSA, or Nedbank is for 10 years or 15 years, then there's a gap. So it's always key that, the two are aligned, because if they are not aligned, the bank, when they come in and do their due diligence, one of the things that they will surely pick up is the fact that, the offtake is not bankable.
Mm. Okay, it sounds like there's a lot for our junior miners to consider here today. I've certainly learned quite a lot, and I hope our junior miners on the call have also found it quite beneficial. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I wish that we had the whole day to do this. As Mpho said, we could write a book if it were possible. Just for the benefit of our junior miners as we close off, if they need assistance with regard to the specificities that we have discussed on this call, Mpho, from an APSA perspective, who do they reach out to? Also to Vivian, Mashudu, and Thabiso, where do they go if they need assistance? We appreciate that this might not be you, but any sort of insight as to which direction do they go to? Yeah.
I think from an APSA perspective, they can reach out to me. There's no common one point of contact, but they can reach out to me. You can share my email details.
All right. Thanks, Mpho. And Thabiso, on your side?
I think the easiest for us is to go onto our website, www.idc.co.za, and then you'll find the links that can take you to the mining team in case there is something that you want us to look at. Thanks.
Okay, great. And Vivian?
I did see that I think Fred also put his hand up. So obviously this is part of the first session that we are partnering together with the JMC to provide this kind of information and resource to the junior mining economy. So I think first and foremost, reach out to the JMC, and we collaborate with the JMC, and we make resources available, and we work together to try and assist wherever we can. So I think firstly JMC, and then Fred, you and I will correspond, and we will support the JMC in whatever capacity that we can.
Okay, thanks, Vivian. And Mashudu, on your side?
Thanks, Peter. I think I'm aligned with Vivian. Otherwise, happy also to assist where, junior miners want some guidance from a funding perspective. As I mentioned earlier, we do get these approaches from these international lenders looking for a project to fund. So happy to assist on that front. And you've got my email address. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I think just in closing, maybe just to highlight the top points from each of our speakers today. From Mpho's perspective, we really emphasized betting on the jockey and not the horse. Get your house in order. Know what's going on in your business. This is also echoed by Thabiso, and he shared the sentiment that while the IDC might be a little bit more patient, they might give you a little bit more leeway, you still have to have the right team that's supporting you. You still have to know your story, have your financials in order. The number one way to lose confidence from a lender is not knowing any specific part of your business that they may ask you. Viv has strongly emphasized that preparation is key, especially from an ESG perspective. Try to approach it with a pay-it-forward mentality to the communities that you're going to be going into. And Mashudu has emphasized the point of maybe explore less traditional ways of financing than the ones that are more popular or the ones that seem to be more used in the modern day era. try the road less traveled and see where that leads you. And that's all for me. That brings us to an end of today's session. A huge thank you to our panelists today for their valuable insights, and to you as well, our audience, for joining us and asking us those probing questions. If you have any further questions, our panelists have graciously let you know where they can find them. And as Viv mentioned, this is one part of a longer series, and we look forward to seeing you on the next session. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.